So good afternoon. Thank you very much for hanging around to hear me talk. I will try and give you some interest and some excitement, and talk about some futuristic things, perhaps even as well. Things that, of course, as has been commented several times today, might sound crazy today, might not sound so crazy in the future. So if we're not talking crazy, we're probably not talking about the right stuff. Before I run into the slides, probably a little bit of background. So I've been involved in Cityscape since 2003. I got lucky because I was brought in by a friend of mine who I met yesterday, actually, who was over from Australia. He brought me in to write some database code. I was supposed to be working on a GIS database project for Cityscape, and I was sat in the corner. But by now, I'd been much more interested in getting involved in the creative business, so I managed to kind of slyly get myself off the database project, which wasn't actually going very well, and got myself involved into this company because what I saw back then was there was a massive opportunity to take, at the time I joined the company, it was massively creative, some great technical people, and we were involved in this industry. It was building pretty amazing buildings. We started out working on the cheese grater. At that point, I didn't know anything about architecture, didn't really know much about the building, but I could see it was pretty cool. So I was really interested in what we were doing. And over the first couple of years, I got involved in the architectural side. I was fascinated by the process of the idea of, so as a visualization company, basically, we produced 2D images of buildings. They were really, really, really high quality. But the problem was that by the time we had finished creating this really, really high quality image, the building had changed. So many, many man hours, awesome looking stuff, but every time we showed somebody an image, they just said, it's wrong. We were like, what do you mean it's wrong? You know, we followed the plans, the drawings, and spent a very long time making it right, so how come it's wrong? And then, of course, you sort of realize pretty rapidly that the reason it's wrong is because design is always wrong, because you have to keep iterating it, and that is the nature of design. So that's how it is. So we kind of worked away at this, producing really great images that were fantastic for planning permissions, for large buildings, for sales, because obviously they used it to pre-sale buildings, brochures, videos. But all the time we had the same problem. Of course, the problems were experienced on both sides. So the architects kept saying, you know, why is the joints not up to date? The client would say, come on guys, you know, you're holding the project up. So we persisted this for a while, and slowly it became clear that we needed to take a new look at what we were doing, because, well, we're getting paid pretty well for it, but as you know, if you keep accepting more and more changes, in the end, your margins go down. And that isn't great for any industry, and certainly wasn't great for us. So it didn't take too much to work out that we needed something new, something fluid. And I think this was back in 2008. And we were fortunate enough through a contact to meet Mark Rain, who was one of the founders of Unreal, Epic Games. And he was very kind enough to let us have a go with his game engine technology. Now, the thing that made it really suitable was the fact that even though back then it was a real struggle, as any of you who have tried for the first time, putting a really detailed CAD model into a game engine probably experienced nothing much happening. That's what happened to us in 2008 when we tried it. So we kind of learned through a lot of trial and error how we got these really detailed CAD models into game engines. But the point was, once we got it there, it did actually work well, because back in those days, we were waiting for renders overnight, sometimes for 2 nights, sometimes for 3 nights. And that doesn't really match very well with project deadlines. People don't really give you much flexibility on these things. But getting the render now, that was pretty handy. Everyone liked that. And it also turned out that it didn't actually matter so much whether the render looked so great, because what was more important is that people could understand the design. And since the whole process is an evolution of design, what's really important is, can we understand what the design looks like right now, ideally now? So we saw from the early uses of it that it worked. And in fact, I think we were supposed to do it for a marketing project for a developer in Croydon. They were developing a residential tower, and they actually saw the potential of using this in their marketing suite. But of course, what happened? Commissioned to do the marketing model. We put in the marketing model, and what do you think happened the first time we showed them the model? They said, it's wrong. So they went into the bathrooms, had a look at the bathroom. They said, really needs to move the cabinets around, doesn't work very well. They looked at the common parts, so the common parts doesn't work very well. The user experience isn't very good. But of course, actually, this isn't bad news because we're sitting there thinking, well, actually, no, this is the point, because the point is it's working. Now, because it was our first go at it, we didn't really have a suitable commercial solution lined up behind this. So yes, we had to do lots more work for the same fee. But what we did learn was that it was answering the brief. The point was it was answering the commercial need of the project. And any kind of innovation, any kind of improvement technology is great, but no one's going to pay for it, of course, unless it delivers some value to the project. And ideally, it's got to deliver some value across the whole operating lifetime of the project. Not just to the day when the thing is built, that's day zero. It's got to deliver operating value across the lifetime of that whole building. And that, I mean, a developer is pretty interested in having a great product, but actually the occupier, that's the buyer or the operator, the person who rents it, is the person who actually enjoys or needs to have that valuable place. So these things basically emerged as we went over time, and slowly it became clear that if we were going to successfully persuade people to pay us to do all the work, and any of you who've tried this, again, will know how much work is required to take a tool like Unreal, which is great, but to make it work with detailed data is a fair amount of work, and to make it look good as well. If we're going to do all that work, we now need to communicate to our clients, and actually not just to our clients, because as I said, it's about the operating value of the property. That means we need to somehow communicate with, ideally, with the occupier, because actually it's the occupier's building in the end, it's not anyone else's. So this is really the thoughts that informed how we move forward. And it was pretty clear that to get commercial value, you have to have process innovation. As in, it's no good bringing the technology. It's a bit like having a sharper knife. You can have a knife, you can make a sharper knife, but there's only so much more value a knife can create if you just make it sharper and sharper and sharper. If the idea is you want to consume your meal faster, you've got to innovate the whole process. It might be better to blend your meal and drink it out of a glass or something. Having a sharper knife doesn't speed up the speed of eating your meal. So the same thing applies to VR and any of these technologies, AI, all these things. If you just sort of bolt it on, it isn't going to generate much value. It's going to be a few percent because we haven't actually changed the process. We can't release process gains. So let me run you through a couple of these slides. Where do I need to point this thing? There we go. So as I've really already mentioned, we kind of started out life as a visualization studio doing 2D CGIs and photography. And I'm going to talk to you more about our work in the VR realm now. So is VR the future? Well, not really, because it's happening now. There are still things to move forward in technology terms, but there's plenty of technology around for us to start innovating our processes, so we don't need to worry too much about the technology. We're advising clients currently with developments over 20 million square feet, probably nearer 30, and we're doing that in the capacity of helping them to change the way they're doing their projects, not just to be able to see them, but to change the way they're doing them. And fundamentally, the way that works is really, how does it add value? Well, it adds value as basically as a spatial decision-making tool. The whole project is a series of back-to-back spatial decisions, and also you have to be able to communicate around decisions because you can't make a decision if there is no communication about the space. So fundamentally, VR adds value by being a decision-making and communication tool for space. How does it do that? So unfortunately, it's quite a basic graphic here, but really it does it in a number of ways. So we've got bottom left here, 3D data. As we've been talking about BIM and other things, we're generating more and more 3D data at source. That's what arrives on most projects in the beginning. Not all projects, but most projects. And going into the future, more and more 3D data is going to be the way it gets originated. But it is just data. It's not an experience. Real-time visualization, as just mentioned really, game engine technology means you get a visualization now, not overnight, not in 3 minutes time now. So now we can see that data and we can move around with the game engine controller. It's still 2D, it's still flat on a screen, but if you move around a space and explore it, you can get a pretty good sense of how the space works. But the one that really changes the game here is VR, because with a headset or an immersive projection room, and Solibus was showing some of their stuff earlier, if you get into that thing, the difference is we're now talking about experiences. And we're talking about experiences now of a place that's going to be built in the future. And that's the key thing, because when we're having that experience, and if you wear a headset, it's damn near one-to-one experience of a place that doesn't exist. Now we're getting into a place where we are enabled. We have not done anything yet, we're just enabled. The big thing here is the process in the middle. So with those three things, we're just enabled, but we haven't got anywhere yet. We haven't got any gains at all. But the process is where we bring the gains in, because if we use that enablement to make better decisions faster, yes, we are going to have gains. Now, in the construction industry, there's some pretty big process changes that can happen. Now, some of these things might sound a bit crazy, but we've already talked about the fact that crazy things tend to happen sooner than we think. Now, that process innovation can be everything from minor process innovations, as in, if you look at it at a visualization level, the innovation could be that you just build, and Taryn and others talked about this earlier, you could build an Unreal model and you could basically screenshot your renders out of that. That's one kind of process innovation. You can record movies out of it pretty rapidly. That's another kind of innovation on the visualization level. But the real meaty innovation is at the commercial level. Like what is actually going to build a more valuable building for the entirety of its operating lifetime? Because the operating value of a building is huge. The more specialized the use of that building, like a hospital, the even more big that could be compared to how well hospitals perform now. So I'm going to talk about a couple of ways how that process could look. But when I drew that diagram on a piece of paper, I sat back and thought about all the meetings I'd sat in my time in the property industry. And the main thing I remembered from most of those meetings was that people sitting around a table for long meetings, all talking about a space that they're not in. That essentially is most meetings. They might be looking at 2D drawings and talking dimensions, but dimensions are not spaces or experiences. So then I thought back and thought, well, imagine if at all those meetings, everybody had actually been inside or able to experience the spaces they were talking about. And just thinking about that, I reckon that you could probably achieve a 30% gain in the time it takes to produce a building. And I reckon you'd also produce a more valuable building as well, because you're making decisions in the space that you're talking about now. And actually, when you're not in the space and you're making decisions, you're actually all debating your own spatial visualization that's in your head with the other person and their own imagination of space. And the trouble is, our imaginations are different, so it's not any wonder that we can't agree with each other very quickly. So this is actually about 3 years later, in fact. 2 or 3 years later, one of my colleagues, Tony, was at a conference in Amsterdam, and Airbus had a huge poster on their stand. And they were pointing out that using innovations in the design process of the kind I'm talking about with VR, they'd managed to explore 5 times more creative concepts, 4 less physical prototypes, which is fairly meaty if you're building aircraft, but just the same with buildings though. But overall 30% cost reduction. And that is pretty serious process innovation. But also, what they didn't put on the poster was that, of course, they built a more valuable aircraft at the same time, which means they can charge, which means their airline customers potentially would pay more for it. And of course, the passengers that occupy this aircraft for its lifetime, I don't know what the lifetime of an aircraft is, but I imagine it's 5 to 10 years, are going to continuously, or maybe more, continuously experience the value of this innovation. And that's the point, really. So there's some pretty substantial gains commercially at a very top level to be achieved if you create process innovation with these kind of tools. In automotive, Audi using, and not only Audi, of course, many people are doing this, they're using VR in the showrooms. But the thing that interested me was the question is, why were they using it? Are they using it just to differentiate and say, well, look, come to our showroom because we've got VR and they haven't? That can make sense. It's still relatively new. You can pull people in with that. But I happened to spot an article by their CMO, and actually one of the key things they were looking for VR to do was to innovate their sales process in a very substantial way. Because what they noticed was that the problem is you can go to the website now, and you can go shopping for your Audi, and you can press all the buttons, and it can configure the thing for you online, and it tells you how much it is. So you can do all of that online. So the question is, why, if you can do all that online, why would you bother going to the dealership at all? Because you've basically done all the work from your desk. What the issue is that people tend to go to the dealership, not because they don't know what an Audi looks like. I mean, they see them driving around. The brand is strong. you're not really substantially doubting that the finish of the leather in the car is going to be dodgy. You're not really doubting whether the bodywork is going to hold up. One of the main reasons they noted was that people are going to dealerships because they want to talk to someone to say, can I have a discount? Now, if you've gone to the trouble of actually having some real estate showroom, prime retail location, and someone's walking in to ask you for a discount, it's not really a very good process. So what they want to do is provide a way that people could actually get into VR, customize the car, specify the options, and actually build their Audi experientially. And that fundamentally changes your relationship with that product. It's now your car, and you've experienced it, more importantly. It's experiential. It's very different from tapping on a website. So they found that this would actually drive up the sale price. In automotive, the margins are in the options, so it drove up the margins, and it improved their brand experience because people have a more close association with the car, and also a more close association with the brand as a whole. So these are kind of two very big examples of process innovation that drive really significant commercial gains. It's not just a few percent. This could be very, very substantial. So as I've really commented kind of already, there are some fairly substantial things it could do in terms of personalization, the concept of build to order, collaboration and decision making. Now, one of the big ones is focus grouping, really, which the construction industry really does very little of. But if you look at most other industries, they wouldn't dream of investing 10 million, 50 million, $100 billion in something that hasn't been focus grouped substantially. So this kind of thing can now happen experientially with VR because you don't have to talk about what it's going to be. You give people an experience. And as others have talked about and shown today, you can actually make that thing with them live. You can say, what kind of car, what kind of flat, what kind of office layout do you want? And they can express it themselves or with your help. To make all this stuff go further at a market level, it needs more integrators, more people to support you using the tools, more programmers. So if you're an architect, I guess you might be looking for a programmer. Well, if there were more of them, it would make it faster. Specialised consultancies to help in the application, the financial business modelling, like I've talked about. Universities to educate people from a younger age, especially in long architectural engineering courses, to use this technology from the beginning. Some are still teaching 2D or saying don't use computers at all still. And tools to make more naturalistic ways of interacting will obviously help. I mean, quite obviously, you can use this technology across the whole process. That kind of goes without saying, really. So just a couple. So we've found there's been pretty strong adoption in real estate based on the kind of things I'm talking about. So we worked with Sky on their campus in northwest London. We worked with them for 3 years. Battersea Power Station is a fairly large sort of marketing deployment. Capital and Counties are building 77 acres of central London, and it's very hard to imagine what that could be like without actually making it virtually first. Lend-Lease, International Quarter London, and Canary Wharf Groups, and this is just a few of the people, but they are adopting it for very strong commercial reasons. In terms of specific use cases we've worked on, things like investment pitches, public engagement consultation, design development review, prototyping, focus grouping is an emerging use case, planning negotiations, virtual show homes, are all kind of fairly obvious. Some of the sort of specific things we've observed about it is that quite often, if you're like with Sky, what happened is the CEO of Sky was involved because they were spending 600 million quid, so he wanted to know what was going on with it. Also, they were developer occupied. It was their building. He wanted to know exactly where everything was going to be because they're going to be living in the building for its operating lifetime. And for them, it needs to be exactly right. If you're a developer, it needs to be kind of right. If you're the occupier, it needs to be absolutely right. One of the huge things, probably the biggest out of these probably, was that he was able to get a design review down from, say, 2 or 3 hours down to maybe 10 minutes. Because he could race around a sort of a very, very large building with a game engine controller, which we actually had installed in his office with our operator just down the corridor. So the whole contact time for him of a full design review became 15 minutes, and it was about 3 hours. Now he wants to run Sky Corporation, not ideally try to learn how to read plans and drawings, if at all possible. And it worked very effectively. Probably the other one to pull out really is obviously psychology of engagement. I mean, you can ask people loads of questions, you can have a clipboard and ask them questions, but really they're kind of thinking from up here. When you're in VR, you're connecting the whole person. It's an emotional experience, it's a rational experience all in one. So if you're trying to focus group on how to build the next generation kind of retail unit for Tesco's, or maybe a new office space, or maybe a new hospital, you need to engage the operators, the people who are actually going to use it in VR, because they will then feed back to you from all of their experience accurately. And that can then be designed in and tested. Obviously, it's a very rapidly changing area. So when you start investing, and the numbers are not big now to get into the game with this, but of course it does make sense to remain connected to the key vendors so that you're aware of their roadmaps. It's worth getting in the game anyway, but it's best not to spend too much money without staying in touch with people like Novo, where hardware's going, because that's really enabling us to run bigger and bigger simulations for people. And so by staying in contact with them, you can kind of keep yourself kind of de-risked against suddenly spending tons of money in something that turns out that Unreal might be integrating their software in spring. So just a couple of images. So obviously some VR experiences are outside in the main area. But so with Sky, as I say, we were working with PLP for a number of years on this building. And we were pretty much taking CAD model. The pipeline was we took CAD models from PLP, potentially or sometimes on a daily or sub-daily basis, and updated them straight into the build. And then the client could just walk down the corridor and walk around it. So this was up at the top here, I think it was the last sort of screen capture from a similar location to the photo. And it's not quite the same position, but they basically they hardly had any on-site construction amendments. I mean, this is just the least exciting thing to talk about in terms of commercial value. The operating value they got from this was huge, but even in terms of sort of 50, hundreds of thousands of on-site construction amendments, there were hardly any major ones at all, unlike on the previous buildings, because of course they'd seen it. And in fact, the guys working on it said that when they walked into it, it was almost an anticlimax from the perspective that they'd been walking around the building for the last 2 years. So when they walked in, it wasn't like, oh gosh, wow, this is, as in discovery, wow. They thought it was a fantastic building, obviously, but they'd seen it for 2 years. So there were no surprises, basically, even though they thought it was a fantastic building. And they made some they were able to make very good and quick design feedback. So I guess that made them even happier with the building, because they looked at it and said, that's what I wanted, and it's well designed. This was a slightly random one. We were in a meeting with an entrepreneur who used to be, I think he was a Navy diver, and he woke up one morning and he decided he was going to build the deepest dive centre in the world. So I sat in the first meeting with him, and I hope he wouldn't mind me saying that we didn't have any even plans or drawings to look at. And he described this multi-level pool to me, and I was really, not being a diver, I was very, very confused about what he was talking about. So I said, well, why don't we do a workshop? And this is process innovation in our field. Why don't we do a workshop? Well, we're going to make this thing now. We've done this with a couple of people now. So basically, in about 3 hours with the architect, 3 hours with the client, we made a less beautiful looking version of that. And they were both, basically, we would do an iteration with them, put the headset on, and after about 3 hours with client and architect in the room, we'd created this whole thing, got some library models in there. So they were able to understand the whole facility. Then we obviously made the finish look better for the final images. But that was very handy, and he's been using that in his investor pitches. In investor pitch, of course, if you've got an investor pitch and you've got 45 minutes with their investment board, the last thing you want to do is spend 25 minutes trying to explain how the pool works, because that's your mega pitch time. So the process innovation point about this in a pitch is that you can quickly drive around this thing with them, and in 2 minutes, they've completely understood your facility. Then you've got 43 minutes left with some unconfused people to pitch the commercials. So it's pretty powerful. Battersea, they used it in a marketing, in their high net worth marketing channel. So they would take people around the building. Of course, at the moment, it's an empty kind of derelict site, or soon to be inaccessible. So to be able to actually walk around the whole building, it's a pretty large area, is invaluable. And actually, they did that with Apple just before Apple took 400,000 square foot in that building, so they would have been able to walk around the whole thing. This is the Earls Court master plan, so it's a huge development, and the whole thing is modelled in, the whole 77 acres is modelled in Unreal. And so they use that for pretty much probably over 10 use cases, investor briefings, stakeholder consultations, and all these things. So the ROI on these kind of modellings in VR is very, very high, because you're never just doing it for one thing. So this is where the consultancy comes in, because if you use it for one use, it's very expensive. If you use it to drive investment, leasing, but most importantly, if you get the place right, again, the operating value of this place, if it's designed correctly, will be so much higher that it just vanishes into the cost of it vanishes away, because you're talking about a huge operating value for a site over its lifetime. Lend-Lease, this is quite a good one because they phoned up suddenly and said, we need to go to market with this development. The show flat is currently about 9 months to a year away. Can you do anything for us to basically drive the marketing suite while we do this? So we had a sort of, I think we started off the project, it was basically a shell of a house, townhouse. And in 4 to 5 weeks, we basically workshopped again live to create the design. There wasn't a design, and then created the marketing deliverable, which is actually running out there. And we did it in sort of about 5 weeks, including the design phase. So that was great for them. Again, it was very commercial because they needed something to really be the feature of the show suites. And in fact, it's better than the show flat because you can obviously walk around the whole thing experientially. So it's actually more powerful and do options and things like that. Come and see our demos. So probably just to summarize by saying that VR is one of the tools that is going to drive process, or is going to enable process innovation. But things like AI, rapid modeling is very important because the speed of origination of 3D data is a rate determining step here. Computer modeling is very powerful. But most importantly, no client is going to pay for any of this stuff in the end unless it makes them more money. It's kind of simple, or adds more value to their brand. And what we've found is that when you work through the value points with them, when you talk about the operating value of the building over its whole lifetime, then it becomes much clearer why and how important it is to involve everybody in the design process. And I saw Lang & Rourke earlier talking about modular build. The thing is, in the industry, what it means is you can create places in focus groups with consumers way ahead of when they need to buy it. That means you can now, almost as a thought experiment, make to order. You can get user feedback from, you can say to a 13-year-old, what kind of flat do you want to live in when you're ready to buy? And you can work with them in a workshop and get that actually expressed in 3D. They don't have to be able to describe it, they can make it. And that's going to change the industry towards being more retail focused. The technologies will improve the efficiency and the speed. And the thing is, as an industry, I think it's something we need to do, because if we don't do it, then we have an Elon Musk automotive situation on our hands. Now, the car companies thought for 100 years that they were the car people. And it would have been crazy to say that someone who was a non-automotive person could come into the industry and start building cars. But he did. And it didn't take a whole lot more than 5 years and a few £1 billion. Now, building a car factory is a lot more difficult than, and takes more capital building a building. So if the industry doesn't do it, then what's going to happen is tech-driven investment is going to drive these kind of changes into the industry. So I think from my perspective, it's about kind of looking at the technologies, but most importantly, where is the value in the whole thing? And then we look to the technologies and we deliver that. So it's an exciting time, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. And there might be time for 1 or 2 questions if you have any.